The first weeks of captivity were filled with tension, silence, and guarded glances as hundreds of Japanese prisoners of war were processed through the barbed wire gates of the American camp. Most arrived with untreated wounds, blood and dirt crusted into gashes after weeks of jungle combat and chaotic surrender. The long marches, the endless heat of Pacific Islands, and the unrelenting fear had left their bodies broken, but nothing prepared them for the strangeness that awaited inside. After registration, identification checks, and distribution of basic supplies, they were herded into a large wooden building marked with a prominent red cross. The sight stopped many of them in their tracks. The structure did not look like anything they had seen in the Pacific Theater. Rows of clean white cots lined the walls, each with medical equipment arranged nearby. American medics, efficient and focused, motioned for the wounded to step forward and lie down. For the first time, many realized they were not simply being detained. They were expected to receive medical care. Among the prisoners, confusion spread like a ripple. Medical treatment for Japanese soldiers during the war's final months was nearly non-existent, often improvised in caves or abandoned buildings, and always constrained by severe supply shortages. Proper medicine was considered an impossible luxury, yet here, in the custody of their sworn enemy, they were being directed toward an organized system of healing. Some clutched their wounds protectively as if expecting a trick. Others whispered nervously about the gleaming instruments laid out on metal trays. They remembered warnings drilled into them by officers before battles, that the Americans were demons, that capture meant torture, that prisoners would be left to die in agony. Now staring at sterile bandages and functioning medical equipment, they wondered if this was some elaborate form of cruelty. The medics, impatient with hesitation, spoke firmly in English and gestured again. Shirts, boots, torn uniforms, all had to be removed for examination. One by one, reluctant hands unfastened buttons and bodies scarred by shrapnel and bullets lay exposed. The prisoners felt vulnerable, stripped of dignity in front of strangers. Still, they obeyed, watching with wide eyes as medics approached with scissors, antiseptic solutions, and clean gauze. Then came the touch. American hands, gloved and gentle, began examining wounds that had festered for days or weeks. The sudden contact shocked the men. For an instant they flinched, expecting pain or mockery. Instead, as the medics carefully cleaned debris from wounds and applied antiseptic that stung but soothed, a strange calm began to settle over them. Some closed their eyes, unable to process what was happening. Others watched cautiously, as if testing whether this treatment was truly real. Slowly, the initial terror melted into quiet disbelief. They had not received such careful attention in months, even years. On Guadalcanal, Saipan, and Okinawa, wounded men had been left to fend for themselves, infections spreading unchecked, gangrene claiming limbs. To have enemy medics cleaning wounds, applying bandages, administering care with no apparent cruelty, it was an almost unthinkable reality. Here in enemy hands, they were being treated more humanely than they had ever been in their own Imperial Army field stations. When the initial examinations concluded, clean bandages awaited them, white gauze rolls and adhesive tape stacked in organized supply cabinets. Many prisoners stared at these materials as though they were treasures from another world. They watched as medics wrapped their wounds professionally, not with dirty cloth strips or leaves, but with sterile materials that smelled of disinfectant. For the Americans, this was routine military medical procedure. For the Japanese, it was a revelation. They shuffled out, bandages fresh and white against their skin, bodies still aching but somehow different, and an unmistakable murmur of astonishment passed among them. The fear that had gripped them when first entering the medical building was replaced by bewilderment. Had their captors truly given them healing instead of harm? That first encounter with American medical care lingered in their minds long after. It was the beginning of a series of discoveries that challenged everything they had been taught about the enemy. The experience was not just about treating wounds, it was about confronting the difference between what they had been told and what they now lived. The modern medical care, with its clean instruments and abundant supplies, became a symbol of something larger, the realization that captivity might not mean death, but an unexpected glimpse into another civilization's approach to warfare and humanity. When the first treatments ended and the prisoners filed back into the barracks, a heavy silence spread across the room. They sat on wooden benches, some clutching their fresh bandages, others touching the clean wrappings as if to confirm they were real. Many avoided eye contact as though speaking openly might shatter some fragile reality. Deep inside, however, unease gnawed at them. They had been warned countless times that capture by Americans meant dishonor, torture, and certain death. In whispered briefings before battles, Japanese officers had painted vivid images of sadistic enemy camps where prisoners were experimented upon and left to rot. Yet here the first act forced upon them was medical treatment, wounds cleaned, bandages applied, pain acknowledged and addressed. To many it seemed suspicious, too gentle, too organized. One prisoner, a former infantryman from Hokkaido, recalled how imperial propaganda leaflets had always depicted Americans as heartless barbarians who showed no mercy to the wounded. He had believed those warnings completely. Now sitting with clean bandages wrapped around a shrapnel wound that had festered for 2 weeks, he remembered those propaganda posters with a chill. Could it be that everything had been a lie? But another thought crept into his mind, darker and more terrifying. What if the medical treatment was not meant to heal at all? Rumors circulated quickly, especially among those with sharper memories of military indoctrination. Some whispered the words human experiments, drawing vague parallels to stories they had heard about medical testing. Although few knew details, the idea that Americans might use medical procedures for some hidden cruelty spread fast in hushed tones. The guards noticed the hesitation. They watched groups of prisoners pause at the medical building doorway, their faces clouded with deep mistrust. Orders were repeated, and interpreters explained in broken Japanese that treatment was simply mandatory medical care. But suspicion did not vanish easily. For men trained to believe that surrender was a fate worse than death, any act of mercy carried the taste of deception. They wondered if the antiseptic they were given was poisoned, if the bandages concealed some hidden harm. Some even refused to allow thorough examination, merely showing surface wounds before pulling away. The cultural clash made the moment more jarring. In the Imperial Japanese Army, wounded soldiers were often told to endure pain without complaint, that seeking comfort was weakness. Medics were rare, supplies scarce, and the attitude was one of stoic acceptance. The camp medical facilities, in contrast, were systematic. Organized rows of cots, charts tracking each patient, regular examinations scheduled like clockwork. To the Americans, this was standard military medicine, nothing more. To the Japanese, it felt alien, mechanical, almost incomprehensible in its efficiency. It was care stripped of the fatalism they had known, transformed into something methodical yet unsettling. For days, conversations among the prisoners circled around the same questions. Why would the Americans waste medical supplies on enemy captives? Why clean wounds, apply bandages, and spend time when they could have simply left them to suffer? Was it truly compassion, or was it part of some larger strategy to break them psychologically? Theories multiplied in the dimly lit barracks. Some argued that the medical care was a form of control, a way to weaken resistance by making men dependent on enemy kindness. Others whispered that hidden poisons might be mixed into the medicines, designed to work slowly. Fear clung to them, reinforced by memories of warnings from their superiors. Yet no punishment followed. No hidden cruelty emerged. The men returned to the barracks at night, still breathing, still alive, their wounds visibly cleaner than before. Slowly, suspicion began to erode, replaced by a quieter, reluctant curiosity. The Americans repeated the process the next day, and the day after that. Bandages continued to be changed. Guards made sure every wounded man entered the medical building, and still nothing terrible happened. Suspicion remained, but now it mingled with another feeling: confusion. What kind of enemy would care if their prisoners' wounds healed or became infected? For men raised to believe capture was the ultimate shame, the realization was as unsettling as the medical care itself. The daily rhythm of medical care soon became part of camp life, though at first it felt imposed upon the Japanese prisoners. Each morning or afternoon, depending on the schedule, guards lined them up and marched the wounded to the medical building. At the entrance, they received fresh bandages, antiseptic cotton, and sometimes small tablets of pain medication that dissolved on the tongue with a bitter taste. The routine was mechanical. Enter, remove old bandages, allow examination, receive treatment, accept new dressings, and return to barracks. But as days turned into weeks, the prisoners began to understand that this was not a temporary measure. Medical care was a rule, a discipline enforced just as firmly as roll calls and meal times. The Americans explained treatment procedures through interpreters, gesturing to show how to keep wounds clean, insisting that men report any signs of fever or increasing pain. Infection checks followed, carried out by medics who inspected wounds with careful attention, looking for discoloration or swelling. Sulfa powder was distributed along with instructions on how to apply it. For the first time, many Japanese soldiers realized that the enemy treated wound care as seriously as they treated weapons maintenance. To the Americans, medical hygiene was not a luxury but a necessity for maintaining order, health, and preventing epidemics within the camp. For the prisoners, this routine carried a strange mixture of humiliation and fascination. On one hand, they were stripped of independence, compelled to receive treatment on command like children. On the other, they discovered that life free from constant throbbing pain, festering sores, and the fear of gangrene was surprisingly tolerable. A corporal who had fought on Iwo Jima remembered weeks when his unit had no medical supplies at all, when wounded men stuffed their own injuries with mud to stop bleeding. In contrast, after just a few weeks of enforced medical care, the deep gash on his thigh began to close, the inflammation faded, and he could walk without limping. It was a quiet, undeniable improvement, an irony that gnawed at his pride. Language barriers caused endless confusion in the beginning. Many prisoners did not understand when medics explained the importance of keeping wounds dry or changing bandages regularly, so they ignored instructions. When they tried to skip treatments, they were escorted back, watched patiently until they complied. Some resented the interference, muttering that it was degrading. Yet even in their resistance, they could not deny the results. Their wounds, monitored and treated systematically, no longer smelled of rot. Bandages changed daily no longer stuck to flesh with dried blood and pus. The barracks, once heavy with the smell of infection and decay, grew more bearable, even for those who never admitted it aloud. Gradually, the sense of suspicion gave way to habit. Prisoners began to anticipate the routine, lining up with less resistance. They learned to remove their own bandages carefully, to point out areas of concern, to accept treatments without flinching. Some even compared different medics' techniques, noting which ones were gentler or more thorough. It was a small detail, but for men stripped of freedom, such observations became a form of conversation, a way to fill long hours of boredom. Medical care had transformed from a command into a shared ritual, something that quietly bound them together. What struck many most deeply was the realization that their captors expected them to heal, even in captivity. To be given bandages and medicine was not only about preventing disease outbreaks, it was about enforcing a certain standard of humanity. In the Japanese army, soldiers had been taught that endurance of pain was a mark of honor, that seeking treatment was weakness. Now, under the discipline of their enemy, they were shown that proper wound care could be as much a part of military discipline as carrying a rifle. This clash of values unsettled them, but it also sowed the first seeds of reluctant respect for the strange, relentless order of their captors. The first time a medic cleaned a wound with genuine care, many Japanese prisoners gasped, some even pulling away as though touched by fire. The sensation, gentle, deliberate, methodical, was unlike anything they had experienced in military service. Gloved hands carefully removed debris from shrapnel wounds, cotton swabs soaked in antiseptic cleaned away dried blood, and then came the careful application of sulfa powder that stung briefly before numbing the pain. For men accustomed to wrapping their own wounds with whatever cloth they could find, or worse, leaving injuries completely untreated, the experience was almost overwhelming. The antiseptic smell filled the air, sharp and chemical but somehow reassuring. The medics worked with practiced efficiency, their movements neither rough nor hesitant, treating each prisoner's wounds as though they mattered. Some prisoners remembered how during long campaigns in the Philippines, officers had told them to ignore pain, that complaining about wounds was cowardice. On remote islands, medical supplies were non-existent. Soldiers poured seawater on wounds or packed them with leaves, hoping infection would not set in. The few occasions when a medic could be found, treatment consisted of hasty bandaging before being sent back to fight. Here, however, each prisoner received individual attention, as though such care were standard and unlimited. It was not simply treatment, it was immersion in a completely different philosophy of warfare. The bandages provided afterward deepened the shock. Clean, white, properly sized, they were unlike the torn strips of uniform fabric soldiers had once shared among dozens of men. Prisoners pressed the fresh gauze to their wounds, inhaling the faint scent of sterile cotton. Their injuries felt protected, cushioned, given space to heal. It was more than physical relief. It stirred emotions they had long suppressed. Some recalled family clinics back home, memories of doctors treating childhood injuries with gentleness before the war consumed their lives. Others thought of field hospitals they had glimpsed from a distance, where officers received care while enlisted men were told to endure. The camp medical facilities reawakened those memories, but now framed by the strangeness of captivity. The Americans treated the routine without sentiment, changing bandages and dispensing medicine with the same efficiency as distributing rations. For them it was procedure, disease prevention, maintaining camp health following regulations. Yet to the prisoners it became a quiet revelation. The irony was bitter. They had expected brutality, yet here they encountered care beyond what they had known, even among their own forces. Some felt shame, believing such attention weakened them. Others embraced it silently, grateful for moments when their aching bodies were allowed to feel human again. Over time, the medical treatments reshaped their daily existence. Instead of scratching at infected wounds or ignoring pain that grew worse each day, they learned that proper care accelerated healing. Their injuries, once open and weeping, began to close. The constant throbbing that had made sleep impossible gradually subsided. Even the way they moved changed. Men who had limped for weeks began to walk normally again. The fever that had burned through some prisoners' bodies broke and disappeared. Prisoners began to notice these changes with astonishment, quietly acknowledging that they were healthier than they had been during combat. The paradox gnawed at their minds. How could the enemy, whom they had been taught to despise, provide them with care that their own army had denied? The medical treatments were not just about healing wounds. They were proof of a system so organized, so abundant in resources, that it could extend thorough care even to captives. Lying on clean cots while medics examined their injuries, they could not help but feel both envy and unease. It was a reminder of how different this world was from the one they had left behind, and how far Japan had fallen in offering such basic dignity to its own soldiers. At night, when the barracks dimmed and the long rows of prisoners lay on their cots, the conversations often drifted back to comparisons with their former lives in the Imperial Army. The subject was not tactics, not battles, but the strange discovery of medical care. Men who had fought across Pacific islands, who had endured jungle diseases and coral reef wounds, now whispered about bandages, antiseptic, and the shock of enemy compassion. It was not the sort of topic soldiers had ever considered honorable, but the contrast was too striking to ignore. In the Japanese military, seeking medical treatment had been seen as weakness unless the injury prevented you from holding a weapon. Officers spoke of endurance, of ignoring the body's pain, of embracing suffering as a sign of strength. Soldiers often went weeks with untreated wounds, their skin festering with tropical ulcers, infections spreading unchecked. Malaria and dysentery killed more men than bullets in some campaigns. To complain about it was considered shameful, unworthy of a true warrior. Yet in these American camps, medical care was enforced as though it were a law equal to discipline itself. One prisoner, a former sergeant, recalled aloud how his unit on New Guinea had shared a single rusty medical kit among 50 men. They had used the same dirty bandages repeatedly, boiling them when possible but usually just reusing them soaked in blood. He compared it bitterly to the endless supply of clean materials in captivity. Another man muttered that back in the Philippines, his company had suffered more casualties from infected wounds than from American bullets. Disease had crippled entire units more effectively than artillery. Now here in America, every man with an injury received daily wound checks, and medics treated infection as if it were an enemy to be defeated as aggressively as any soldier. The irony was so sharp that it stung. This recognition spread quietly through the camp. Even those who clung to pride could not deny that their bodies were improving. Infections cleared. Fevers broke. Wounds that would have cost limbs in the field began to heal cleanly. Prisoners began to connect these improvements with the treatments they had once resisted. For the first time they understood that medical care was not softness, it was strength, a weapon against death more powerful than stubborn endurance. The reflections were not only physical but cultural. Many remembered traditions of healing in Japan, herbal medicines passed down through generations, hot springs believed to cure ailments. Medicine had once been part of life, tied to family and ritual. War had stripped it away, reducing men to animals surviving on instinct. Now in captivity, the enemy had returned to them what their own army had denied. The paradox unsettled them. Some spoke of it with longing, remembering village doctors who had treated them as children. Others fell silent, ashamed that it was not Japan but America that had restored this basic human dignity. The guards did not understand the depth of this shock. For them, medical care was practical, tied to regulations and camp health standards. They issued orders without sentiment, never imagining that the routine treatments carried such profound meaning for the prisoners. But within the wire fences, men lay awake, staring at the ceiling, realizing that the very structure of military life they had known was fundamentally flawed. It was not strength to endure untreated wounds. It was not honor to ignore infection. They began to wonder if America cared this much for the health of enemy captives, how much more must it care for its own soldiers? The thought was uncomfortable, yet impossible to silence. Weeks stretched into months, and the medical routine that once felt alien began to carve deep grooves into the rhythm of captivity. Every man knew the pattern: wake up, roll call, meals, and at scheduled intervals the march to the medical building for those with injuries. What had once been met with suspicion now became an almost unspoken expectation. The guards no longer needed to use force, and the prisoners no longer shuffled with such reluctance. They moved in steady lines, knowing their bandages would be changed, their wounds examined, as though it had always been this way. The transformation was not merely physical but mental. The Japanese soldiers, stripped of their weapons and their cause, had regained something unexpected: a recognition of their own survival. Their wounds, properly treated and monitored, no longer festered or threatened their lives. Bodies that had been racked with pain began to function normally again. Even the mirror-like reflections in puddles after rain revealed healthier faces, less gaunt, less marked by the gray pallor of infection. It was an improvement that none could deny, even if they never admitted it aloud. Medical care began to symbolize more than survival. It became proof that they had not been entirely reduced to disposable prisoners. The effects rippled through the barracks. Groaning from infected wounds diminished. The constant changing of sleeping positions to avoid pain decreased. The air smelled less of sickness and more of the faint antiseptic that clung to fresh bandages. Guards remarked, sometimes with satisfaction, that the Japanese prisoners looked more like soldiers again than the broken men who had first arrived. Some prisoners, embarrassed by this observation, still resisted internally, clinging to the belief that such care was meant to weaken their warrior spirit. Yet the truth was plain: they felt stronger. Their wounds healed faster, their sleep deepened, and their energy, though still bound by captivity, grew steadier. For some, this change stirred a different kind of pride rather than shame. They began to keep their bandages neat, to follow the medic's instructions carefully, to maintain cleanliness in the barracks. It reminded them of old traditions back home, of the meticulous care Japanese households took with everything. Cleanliness and order, they realized, were not submission to the enemy. They were reclaiming fragments of themselves, fragments buried under the chaos of war. Even conversations shifted. Men once too bitter to speak now traded quiet remarks about the strangeness of healing, about the irony that they were healthier in captivity than they had been in the field. American medics, practical and unsentimental, kept records of the improvements. Fewer cases of gangrene, fewer amputations, fewer deaths from infection. For the Americans, it was proof that the medical system worked. For the Japanese, it was an awakening. They could not help but notice that their captors treated medical care as a matter of discipline and humanity, not a privilege but a requirement. This lesson unsettled them because it contrasted so sharply with their own military ethos, where endurance of injury was a badge of honor. Here the opposite was true: proper treatment was order, and order was strength. Over time, the suspicion that had once clung to the medical building eroded almost entirely. Men no longer whispered about experiments or hidden poisons. Instead, they began to anticipate treatment, even to appreciate it. The ritual became something to rely upon, a moment of care in a life otherwise stripped of freedom. Some prisoners found themselves looking forward to the clean bandages, the gentle examination, the brief exchange with medics who, despite the language barrier, showed concern for their healing. In the quiet of those routines, many discovered that medical care was more than a rule enforced by guards. It was a restoration of dignity, a way to feel human again, even within the barbed wire. It was a subtle, undeniable transformation, one that changed not only their bodies but their very sense of what it meant to survive. By the time autumn wind swept across the camp and the days shortened, the conversations among the prisoners had shifted, no longer whispered debates about hidden cruelty or poisoned medicine. The talk now revolved around a different kind of astonishment, the realization that these daily treatments were not accidents of captivity, but symbols of something larger. In the dim barracks where men sat cross-legged on their bunks, they began to tell each other stories of their first encounters with American medics, laughing awkwardly at their own fear and marveling at how routine it had all become. One prisoner, once a disciplined infantry officer, confessed that when he first felt enemy hands cleaning his wound, he thought it was a prelude to torture. The others chuckled at the memory, shaking their heads, though many admitted they had felt the same terror. Another man, younger and more talkative, compared the camp medical facilities to the hospitals he had seen in Tokyo before the war. The comparison stirred murmurs of nostalgia, the prisoners momentarily transported back to a world of clean clinics and professional doctors, to times when injury meant treatment rather than abandonment. The irony struck them all. It was in enemy hands that fragments of those civilized memories returned. What unsettled them most was not the medical care itself, but what it revealed about America. If this country had enough resources to maintain fully stocked medical facilities for its prisoners, what must it provide for its own soldiers? If bandages and medicine were distributed here so freely, what advanced treatments must be available on bases back home? The contrast with their own experience gnawed at them. They remembered comrades who died from infections because there was no medicine to treat them. Soldiers who lost limbs because gangrene set in and there were no antibiotics. Men who wasted away not only from battle wounds but from the slow destruction of their bodies by untreated disease. To realize that the enemy placed such emphasis on medical care made many prisoners quietly admit, though never too loudly, that perhaps this was one of the secrets of American military strength. Conversations grew more open around the mess hall tables while eating rations of rice, bread, and vegetables. Some spoke candidly of their shock. They admitted that before capture they had imagined Americans as savage warriors who gave no quarter. Instead, they discovered them to be methodical, organized, even in something as fundamental as treating wounds. Others took it further, suggesting that this reflected an entire civilization built on abundance and systematic thinking, one that had the luxury to extend such practices even to its enemies. These ideas sparked debates, for not all prisoners wanted to admit such uncomfortable truths. Pride still lingered, and many bristled at the suggestion that America was superior in any way. Yet the evidence was undeniable: their own healing skin, their closed wounds, their improved health. For some, the realization turned bitter. They muttered that this care was designed to weaken them, to strip them of the endurance that once defined Japanese soldiers. Others, however, felt something different: a reluctant respect. They began to view the medical treatments not merely as wound care, but as a window into the vast resources, the industrial capacity, and the different philosophy of their captors. In hushed tones, a few even admitted that the experience had changed how they imagined the world beyond the wire. Thus, the medical care once feared as a form of torture became a center of revelation. It was no longer only about bandages and antiseptic, it was about the stark contrast between two worlds, and the realization that their enemy's power rested not only in weapons, but in systems of life so advanced that even prisoners of war were swept into their discipline. Years later, when many of the Japanese prisoners returned home after the war's end, the memory of captivity remained complex, marked by shame, relief, and confusion. Yet among the countless impressions carved into their minds, one image persisted with startling clarity: the medical care. Men who had fought on distant Pacific atolls, who had seen comrades die in jungle ambushes and naval bombardments, remembered above all the sensation of enemy hands cleaning their wounds, the sting of antiseptic, the enforced rhythm of treatment that had first terrified and then transformed them. Some former prisoners spoke of it to their families, awkwardly describing how the Americans had insisted on daily wound care. Their wives and children listened in disbelief. How could an enemy provide such attention? Others remained silent, reluctant to admit that captivity had offered medical treatment superior to what their own army had granted. Yet in private, many acknowledged that the medical standards of the camps had altered their perception of the world. The memory of clean bandages and healing wounds stood as proof of a civilization different from their own, modern, abundant, and organized in ways that Japan, despite its discipline and tradition, could not match during the war years. The recollection was not sentimental. For the prisoners, medical care had been strange, humiliating, even frightening at first, but time reshaped those feelings. As wounds healed, as infections cleared, as the threat of death from gangrene vanished, the association grew stronger. Proper treatment equaled survival. They realized that medical care was not a luxury but a weapon, one that America wielded quietly yet effectively. In barrack conversations after repatriation, some admitted that this lesson was perhaps the most important they carried home, not about military tactics, but about the power of systematic healthcare in warfare. Historians who later interviewed them noted how often medical treatment appeared in their testimonies. Unlike food rations or work assignments, which varied from camp to camp, the routine of wound care was nearly universal. It left an imprint deeper than meals or cigarettes. Men who had endured starvation could accept meager camp rations without surprise. But to have their wounds cleaned and bandaged by enemy medics, to be given medicine that actually worked, this was unforgettable because it was so utterly alien to their wartime experience. It symbolized not indulgence but an entirely different worldview, one where the enemy recognized even captives as humans whose suffering should be minimized. The long-term impact lingered quietly. Some former prisoners, once settled back into civilian life, maintained habits they had learned in captivity. They sought medical treatment promptly when injured, insisting on proper wound care even when resources were scarce. They taught their children that ignoring injuries was not strength but foolishness. For them, the camp medical facilities had not been mere routines, they had been revelations, lessons carried across decades. In retrospect, the memory was bittersweet. It reminded them of defeat, of surrender, of being reduced to captives, but it also reminded them of survival, of unexpected humanity in the hands of an enemy they had been told to hate. For many, it was the paradox that defined their war, that in the very moment of humiliation, they had glimpsed a form of modernity and compassion they could not forget. The medical treatments were not simply about wounds and bandages, they were about discovering that care, organization, and human dignity, even in captivity, could alter the very way a man understood his place in the world.